A billionaire CEO laughed when she saw the man arriving in an old pickup truck to fix her factory disaster. She called his business small. She treated him like he was nobody. What she didn't know: that quiet repair shop owner once designed the very systems her company depended on, and he was worth more than anyone in the room realized. Weeks later, she made the biggest mistake of her career, selling an abandoned factory he secretly knew was worth millions. And when he bought it, he didn't just rebuild the factory. He destroyed her entire market. The morning it happened, Evelyn Hargrove stepped out of her black Bentley and looked at the sign above the door, Callaway Repair and Machining, and laughed. Not a loud laugh, a soft one. The kind that slides out between polished lips without apology. The kind meant to be heard by the people standing closest. Her entourage heard it. Her driver heard it. The two managers flanking her heard it and looked away because that was the appropriate response when their CEO found something beneath her. She did not know that the man inside, the one wiping his hands on a grease-darkened cloth behind a steel workbench, held 7 patents, that 3 of her production lines ran on every single day. She did not know that the quiet of his shop was not the quiet of small ambitions. It was the quiet of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. She had just made the most expensive mistake of her professional life, and she was still smiling when she walked through the door. If this story sounds like something you need to hear to the end, stay with it. Every detail was placed there for a reason. The shop existed at the edge of an industrial block in a mid-sized city that had been growing in all the wrong directions for 20 years. The building was narrow. The exterior paint had gone gray and peeling, and the hand-lettered sign above the entrance had rusted at the corners in a way that made it look older than it was. But inside, the space was different. Every tool hung in its designated place on a pegboard wall, outlined in faint marker, so nothing was ever returned to the wrong hook. The workbenches were clear, except for the active job. The floor was swept each morning before the first customer arrived, even when no customers were expected. The order of the place said something about the man who maintained it, though very few visitors ever paused long enough to read that message. Mason Callaway was 39 years old, and he had been running this shop for just under 4 years since the lease on a larger space had ended, and he had decided quietly and without announcement that smaller was what he needed right now. He had a daughter named Bonnie, who was 6, missing 1 front tooth, and fiercely loyal to a stuffed rabbit named Cotton, who lived on the corner of Mason's workbench during school hours. Mason dropped her at the neighbor's house each morning at 7:45 and picked her up at 5 o'clock. In between, he worked. What most people in the neighborhood did not know, because Mason had never told them and the information was not on any visible surface, was that he had spent 11 years before the shop as a lead systems engineer at Vantex Engineering Group, one of the more respected industrial automation firms on the East Coast. He had designed production line control systems for manufacturers in 7 states. He had filed 7 patents during those years, all under his own name per his contract, all related to precision automation and cascade failure prevention in industrial machinery. 3 of those patents had been licensed to major manufacturers through Vantex's IP division, and the royalty payments deposited into his account each quarter were modest but reliable. Mason had left Vantex not because the work dried up, not because he was pushed out, but because his wife Claire had died of a fast-moving illness when Bonnie was 18 months old and someone had to be home. He had made that choice with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. He did not grieve it publicly. He did not speak about his former career unless directly asked, and almost no one directly asked. His friend Adrian Cole, who had known him since their first year of college and now ran a small investment fund across town, asked about it regularly. Mason's answer was always the same deflection. A slight turn of the head, a return to whatever was in his hands. Adrian understood that the conversation would happen when Mason was ready for it to happen and not before. The one thing that kept Mason's name alive in industrial circles without his name ever actually appearing was his reputation for fixing what others could not. Word moved slowly in that world from plant manager to plant manager, from maintenance supervisor to shift foreman. And the word was simple. If a machine stopped working and no one else could bring it back, "Call the man at Callaway Repair." He did not advertise. He did not have a website beyond a single-page listing with a phone number. He charged fairly. He never failed to deliver. Each evening after Bonnie was asleep and the house was quiet, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and whatever technical documentation he was working through, keeping his knowledge current in the same disciplined way. He kept his tools organized. He was not waiting for anything, but he was ready. The call that changed the trajectory of everything came on a gray Tuesday morning in early October. It did not come to Mason first. It came to a man named Jason Merritt, the chief financial officer of Harrove Industrial, who received it from the plant manager of the company's second manufacturing facility at 6:52 in the morning. The message was direct and alarming. The primary CNC production line had gone down overnight. A cascade fault had propagated through the control board. The entire system was frozen, and the technical team on site had been unable to isolate the source for 3 hours. Harrove Industrial was a precision metal components manufacturer, the third largest in the northeastern United States by revenue, and the second facility was currently under contract to supply a defense subcontractor with a delivery deadline 48 hours away. Jason Merritt called 2 national maintenance contractors before 8 in the morning and received the same answer from both. They could send a team in 72 hours. He called the original equipment manufacturer's service line and was placed on hold. He called Evelyn Hargrove's direct line at 8:20 and told her the situation with the careful verbal framing of a man who had long since learned how to present bad news in the least damaging shape possible. Evelyn listened, said 4 words, "Fix it by noon," and ended the call. Jason's fourth call was to the plant manager who had originally reported the failure, a veteran named Walt Garber, who had been running that facility for 22 years and who responded to Jason's escalating frustration with a flat Midwestern calm. Walt said he knew one person who might be able to help. He said he couldn't guarantee it. He said the person in question ran a small shop and might not take the call. Jason said to give him the number anyway. Walt gave it to him and added before hanging up that this particular person had once diagnosed a cascade fault in under 4 minutes that a certified systems team had spent 2 days misidentifying. Jason Merritt wrote the number down skeptical and dialed it. Mason answered on the 3rd ring. He was already at the workbench. The call lasted 4 minutes. Mason asked which generation of control board, what the ambient temperature in the facility had been the previous night, and whether the fault codes were showing in sequence or simultaneously. Jason answered all 3. Mason was quiet for several seconds after the 3rd answer. The kind of silence that comes from rapid internal calculation rather than uncertainty. Then he said he would come. He asked for the address. He did not ask about the fee, and Jason, flustered, forgot to mention it. Mason hung up, set the phone face down on the bench, and began packing his secondary kit with the methodical efficiency of someone who already knew what he was walking into. He left cotton on the workbench for Bonnie. He left a note on the door. He drove his 11-year-old pickup truck across the city and arrived at Harrove's second facility at 9:40. The facility was large, clean, and surrounded by a fleet of leased vehicles that collectively cost more than Mason's shop. A group of people were standing in the parking lot near the entrance when he pulled in Evelyn Hargrove among them in a charcoal coat, phone in one hand, the other hand raised to shade her eyes as she assessed the arriving truck. Mason stepped out. He was wearing dark work pants, a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his older boots. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder. He looked at the building first, then at the group. Evelyn Hargrove looked at him the way certain people look at things that arrive in an unexpected package with a brief visible recalibration that ends not in openness, but in revised condescension. Her assistant, Cara Whitfield, stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing. Mason nodded in the direction of the general group. No one nodded back. He followed Walt Garber inside. What happened in the next 2 hours and 20 minutes was witnessed only by Walt and the 2 floor technicians who had been asked to remain nearby in case Mason needed assistance. He did not need assistance. He worked through the control cabinet systematically, his movements unhurried, his focus absolute. He did not speak except once to ask for a specific diagnostic cable that Walt retrieved from a side cabinet. He did not consult documentation, which Walt found remarkable given that the system was a proprietary configuration from nearly a decade earlier. At 11:47, the production line restarted. The cascade fault had been a secondary ground loop failure, masking a corrupted initialization sequence, a problem that the original equipment manufacturer's remote diagnostics would likely have taken 2 additional days to correctly identify. Walt stood at the edge of the floor and watched the first components move through the line with the measured satisfaction of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong in this building and not nearly enough go right. Mason packed his tools. He walked out of the facility and back into the main corridor where Evelyn was waiting with Jason Merritt and 2 of the operations managers. She was already on her phone again. When Mason appeared, she ended the call and said with the brisk efficiency of someone settling an invoice. "How much?" Mason gave her the number. It was a fair rate, not inflated, not discounted. Evelyn didn't look up when she instructed Jason to process the payment. Jason, looking at Mason with the poorly concealed amusement of a man who considers himself to have successfully managed a minor inconvenience, said to the room in general that it was a good thing they had found someone. And wasn't it convenient that the small shop rate was so much easier on the quarterly budget than the contract firms? One of the managers smiled. Another looked at the floor. Jason kept talking. Something about operational cost management. And the phrase small operation came out of his mouth twice in 30 seconds. Each time with the same slight inflection that distinguished it from a neutral description and made it something else entirely. Evelyn did not stop him. She was already scrolling through her phone. Kara, standing behind Evelyn, looked at the far wall with a careful blankness that Mason recognized as the expression of someone who was embarrassed by what they were witnessing, but did not have the standing to interrupt it. Mason did not respond to Jason. He did not look at Evelyn for a reaction. He zipped his bag closed in the same unhurried way he had opened it and settled the strap on his shoulder. Evelyn looked up briefly and said with a finality that was almost gracious in its efficiency. "Thank you for coming on short notice. If we have smaller issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word smaller landed in the room and sat there. Mason looked at her directly for the first time that day, and there was nothing in his expression that she could use no offense, no anger, no plea for recognition. He looked at her the way a person looks at a system they are studying, noting its properties without judgment. He said it was no problem. Then he walked out. Walt Garber caught up with him near the exit, reached out and shook his hand with both of his own and said quietly that the control system Mason had just repaired was originally designed by a Vantex team about 9 years back. Said he had been there when it was installed and he'd never seen anyone outside the original team work on it without documentation. He said he didn't know if Mason knew the system from somewhere, but whatever the case, he was grateful. Mason thanked him without elaborating. He walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, looking through the windshield at the clean industrial facade of the building that bore the name Harrove on a brushed steel plate beside the entrance. His face was still, his hands were still. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out a manila folder he had not opened in more than 2 years. It contained a document from his Vantex period, a consulting report he had been commissioned to write on the rehabilitation potential of an older Harrove facility. He looked at the cover page for a moment. Then he put the folder back, started the truck, and drove to pick up Bonnie. Adrian came over that evening with a 6-pack and no particular agenda, which was his way of saying he knew something had happened and he was available if Mason wanted to talk. They sat at the kitchen table after Bonnie was in bed and Mason laid out the day without editorializing the visit, the repair, the payment, the comments from Jason Merritt. Adrian listened to all of it and then asked the question he had been quietly forming since the first sentence. "What are you thinking about?" Mason said he was thinking about the Westbrook facility. Adrian set down his bottle. The Westbrook facility was the third manufacturing plant in the Hargrove portfolio, a property that Evelyn Hargrove had shuttered 14 months ago on grounds of operational inefficiency. It sat on 12 acres in a neighborhood called Westbrook, about 6 miles from where they were sitting now. The machinery inside was old. The building itself was mid-century industrial, and the whole property had been carrying a for sale listing for 9 months with no takers because of its reputation as a money pit. Adrian knew all of this because Mason had mentioned it once before months ago in a context that had not seemed important at the time. Now hearing Mason say the name again in that tone, Adrian understood that it had been important all along. What Adrian did not know in that moment, what Mason told him over the next hour, was the full shape of what existed inside Westbrook and why the conventional wisdom about it was wrong. Mason had been inside that facility 5 years earlier during his consulting period when Hargrove's previous management had commissioned a rehabilitation study before Evelyn took the helm. He had spent 3 days there with a small technical team, and he had written a detailed report concluding that 70% of the installed equipment was recoverable with targeted investment, and that the production capacity, if properly upgraded, would outperform either of Hargrove's active facilities at a significantly lower per-unit cost. That report had been submitted, received, and as Mason had later learned, forwarded by Evelyn to Jason Merritt to be handled. It had not been acted on. The facility had been closed. Instead, Mason knew the report had gone into a drawer because he had followed up once professionally and received a form response. He had not followed up again, but he had not forgotten what he had seen inside that building, and he had not forgotten the specific equipment configurations, the infrastructure layout, or the particular capabilities that could be unlocked if someone who understood the underlying systems was willing to do the engineering work. Someone who had, as it happened, designed several of the control systems that would integrate with that equipment. Someone who held the patents. Adrian asked one question.